So, hello and welcome to our presentation on occupation and international humanitarian law, or on conflict in occupation. My name is Yanni Kent and I'm an intern with the Government Relations and IHL Department for the American Red Cross, and helping me present is my other intern, Amelia.
Hi, my name is Amelia Steffen, and I am a legal intern with the International Humanitarian Law Team.
And over the course of this presentation, we will be giving you an introduction to the laws of occupation and international humanitarian law, while also giving you a chance to see how these laws impact real-world decision-making. And with that, let's move to the next slide.
So first, I wanted to start with a broad definition of what occupation is. So in international law, a territory is considered occupied when it is placed under the actual control of hostile armed forces. So when occupation begins and ends hinges on the definition of actual control. And which we will discuss on the next slide. However, occupation is encompassed by the definition of international armed conflict. And an international armed conflict occurs when one or more states have recourse to armed force against another state, regardless of the reasons or intensity of this confrontation. So therefore, occupation is regulated by the 4 Geneva Conventions, as well as Additional Protocol 1. And the occupying power also faces additional obligations to the occupied territory that are related to human rights. And we will go more deeply into those obligations and explore their nuances during this presentation.
So now that we have a broad definition of occupation, it's important to explore how occupation begins and how it comes to an end. As was stated, the presence of hostile armed forces is the key identifier to the start of a military occupation. However, there are differences in what the definition for its established level of control or authority is for identifying the true start of occupation. And there are 2 definitions for this, and we will get into this in later slides. But when you look at when occupation ends, the definition is a bit more clear. Occupation ends when hostile forces have either left the territory or they can be still present in the territory. However, control of the local government and the civilian services in the territory have been reestablished to the previous territory. And now you can move to the next slide. So there are 2 definitions for when there is actual control of a territory. So the first definition is the definition by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and it is in a commentary on the 4 Geneva Conventions. This interpretation states that actual control exists and the territory is considered occupied whenever a party to a conflict exercises some level of authority or control within a foreign territory. So this means that even when the forces are invading a territory, that area where they're rolling through could be considered occupied territory. However, there is another definition that is accepted by many countries' military manuals that state that actual control exists when a party to a conflict is in a position to exercise sufficient authority over enemy territory to enable it to discharge all the duties imposed by the laws of occupation. And so although these are 2 slightly different interpretations of when actual control exists for occupation to begin, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that for the purposes of this presentation, the occupation begins when the presence of a hostile army is asserting some form of authority in a territory. And so that means that if the territory is now deferring to what the invading forces are saying to govern how occupants are living and behaving, then you can consider that territory occupied.
So now that we've explored how occupation begins and ends, I wanted to discuss the obligations the occupying power has to the occupied territory. And these rules, the rules of occupation, can actually be sorted into 4 areas: sovereignty, temporary, judicial, and medical. And so if you could go to the next slide, please. Our first rule is that the occupying power cannot acquire sovereignty over the occupied territory. That is not allowed. And the next is that occupation is temporary. It is not considered a permanent solution. And although there are times when occupation can last for a while, it is really a temporary state of being. And next, the third area encompasses legal or judicial obligations that the occupying power has to the occupied territory. So under this, the occupying power must respect the laws of the territory that were in effect prior to when the occupying power took over the area. And the occupying power cannot force enlistment into the occupying armed forces. They can't transfer the civilian population, whether it's forced or voluntary. There can be no collective punishment, taking of hostages. The occupying power cannot confiscate private property, and the occupying power must respect cultural property. And then further, if the occupying power arrests or detains anyone within the occupied territory, the occupying power must charge the individual with a specific crime and then allow them to legal counsel and a fair trial. And then next we have medical. And the medical obligations of the occupying power is that they must restore and ensure public health and safety, and they must ensure that there is sufficient hygiene, public health standards, and medical care. And then also, the occupying power has to allow humanitarian activities to be carried out. And this means that the occupying power has to allow organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent to carry out their humanitarian aid programs within the occupied territory.
So moving on to the next part of our presentation, it's very important when considering the law of occupation and international humanitarian law to realize that it is seeking to govern human decisions when in armed conflict and when dealing with occupied territory. And so to emphasize this point, we are going to be presenting you with fictional case studies that are all in a single context so that you can see different perspectives from individuals on different sides of a conflict and occupation and see how these laws influence their decisions, change the course of like how a conflict can go, and also how this would interact with just various political states within the occupation. And so this will be a kind of interactive portion of the event. So we will have polls that you will be able to say your opinions as we will be posing you questions on what you believe the proper course of action will be. And so for this scenario, the common backstory for all of these different case studies is that there are two countries, Genovia and Panem, that are neighboring countries which share an eastern border. Tensions have been rising along this border, and the Panem forces have started to even attack some of the border towns. But now the tensions have risen so high that Panem forces are starting to invade Genovia and move towards its western capital. And so all of these different various scenarios are happening in the eastern region of Genovia, which is currently being occupied by Panem forces. And so you will be taking the perspective of various individuals on both sides of the conflict and having to make decisions given the context that we will give you, and you will have the opportunity to vote in interactive polls. And so now moving to our first scenario.
So for our first scenario, you're going to take the perspective of a Genovian citizen. And Panem forces have been rolling through your territory and fighting for the past 4 months. And however, they seem to be setting up command in your town now. Although your family has still managed to listen to radio broadcasts from the Genovian government encouraging resistance, local officials within your town seem to be complying with the demands of Panem forces. So under this scenario, do you think that occupation has begun? And we will launch a poll, and you can go ahead and answer in the poll whether or not you think occupation has begun, or if you have any thoughts, you can go ahead and put them in the chat as well. So right now we have about 86% saying yes and 14% saying no occupation. If anyone wanted to go ahead and put in the chat, perhaps maybe why they think occupation has started or why they think that occupation hasn't started.
Okay, we can move on to the next slide. And so the answer to this one is that occupation has begun. So let's think about this. Let's think about this scenario that we've put forth. We know that we have been in a town that has seen troops roll past, but has been able to maintain their local government. We also know that now there has been a base or some type of effective control station established in our town. And also, while we are able to hear broadcasts from Western Panem or Western Genovia, those are not orders of actually directives that can be followed, and actually our local government is deferring to Panem officials. And so all of that is telling us that the Panem forces in this region, in this territory, have established some level of effective control or actual control. And so now we can thus verify that we are currently being occupied in this town in Genovia. And so that is just an example of how these case studies will go. And with each one, they get a little bit more complex. And so make sure to think about all these various states that you're in these different scenarios.
So for our next scenario, we're going to be assessing medical necessity. And so for this scenario, you are now a Panem commanding officer. So you're a part of the occupying power, and you're stationed in occupied northeastern Genovia. And although control is now firmly established in the town, much fighting led up to it, and many civilians in the town and the surrounding areas still depend on the local hospital to treat their wounds and various injuries. However, you've just gotten word that a heavily injured Panem division will be coming through your town. And other subordinate officers stationed with you have been trying to persuade you to clear the beds in the hospital for the incoming soldiers. Though the pressure is mounting, you are unsure of your decision. The unit is 2 days out. So what is your decision? Are you going to clear the beds for the Panem forces coming through? Or are you going to keep them open for the Genovian citizens who are there? And again, if you have any comments or thoughts, you can go ahead and use the chat. It looks like we have a strong lean right now towards maintain care for existing civilian patients.
Okay, so it looks like the decision is to maintain care for existing civilian patients. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that is a correct answer. Civilian needs must be met. Now, if we look back at this situation, it's a very complex one, because although we're understanding that civilian needs must be met and many civilians use this hospital, we also know that the forces coming in are heavily injured. And as a Panem officer, you might not want to deny care to those various soldiers. And so what avenues can you take? Know that as an occupying power, you have to try and maintain order and also the civil services that were provided in that area prior to occupation. And so that means that you need to make sure that civilian needs are met and satisfied before your personal military needs, or you divert resources to your military forces. So in this situation, we know that the hospital is being used by many civilians who have been hurt in the recent conflicts. But we also know we have an injured division coming in that would also need care. So what can you do? Let's think. So you can take beds or request beds that are used for patients that are soon to be discharged, don't need intensive care, if you have anyone who's severely injured from the Pan-Am forces. But it's always making sure that civilian needs are not being sidelined or not being totally disrespected by the command decision that you're making. And so this is a theme that will continue on throughout most occupation scenarios in general. As an occupying power, you have a duty to maintain a semblance of order, of normalcy, and of provided care and civilian services that were upheld and maintained. And so that is one of your primary goals as an occupying power. So we can move to the next scenario, case study.
So for some, this is a real life case study of medical necessity during occupation. And this example is that can be seen in the Gaza Strip. So Israel continues to hold effective control of many aspects of life in Gaza, and the scope of control imposes on Israel a responsibility for the safety and welfare of the residents there in accordance with the laws of occupation. And military occupation of Gaza has impacted the quality of medical care accessible to civilians living in the area. There are increased restrictions on who can leave Gaza to receive medical care, although there is an exception for urgent medical cases. And further, Israeli control over the fuel supply has decreased access to necessary medicines and medical supplies reaching Gaza. There have also been instances when medical supplies have reached the crossing point into Gaza, but have been rejected by the Israeli armed forces. And so this is just a real life case study to show how medical necessity and may play out in real life during occupation, and how these needs still need to be met in the real world outside of our hypothetical.
Okay, so our next scenario is centered around population relocation. And so in this scenario, you're Pan-Am general in control of the southeastern occupied territory of Genovia. And although this area is under control, there has been a growing and threatening rebel movement. You've had trouble finding the rebel cells as they are heavily dispersed within and supported by the occupied civilian population. Searching for solutions to your problem, you've been considering moving the population of heavily rebel-occupied towns to refugee camps already established in Pan-Am. Although it would not necessarily fix the rebel problem, it would divide them and make their operations more difficult. So the missive ordering the forced relocation is sitting on your desk. Do you sign? It's looking like a majority is saying no. Feel free to actually drop your opinions in the chat as well, because this is a very complicated situation. As an occupying power, you want to maintain control over an area, but how do you maintain that control? Forced relocation remains a prohibited activity. I see that in the chat. And it looks like you cannot forcibly move civilians. You could arrest them if they are suspected of a crime. And so it looks like most of our polls are saying that 76% of a poll says that no, you cannot relocate the civilians.
So the answer is, and everyone in the chat was correct, population relocation is prohibited. And so forcing a civilian population in these areas to refugee camps would be a violation of IHL and the rules of occupation. Now, something that is interesting to note is there is an exception to this prohibition on forced displacement during occupation. And this exception is when there is a security risk to civilians, or you can move a civilian population for imperative military reasons. And this may be such as clearing a combat zone. And so it is possible that you could make an argument, perhaps as a Panem, on the Panem side, that the growing rebel movement may present a security risk for civilians, like the civilians need to move so they're not further harmed, or that the growing rebel movement is going to cause that area to now become a combat zone. However, at the time that the Panem personnel are looking at this order to move civilians to the refugee camps, none of this is really occurring. And this would really just be an example of forced displacement. And these arguments that this would fall within the exception would most likely not be successful. And so at this point, this would be a forced relocation, and forced displacement of population is prohibited during occupation.
And for a case study showing this law and occupation, it actually shows that exception that Amelia was talking about. And so from 1998 to 2000, there was a border conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And Eritrea actually invaded Ethiopia. And there was the primary location of the conflict was called the Central Front. And many of the civilians living in that region either fled to caves, fled to Ethiopia, or even there was the option presented by the Eritrean forces of actually IDF camps, so refugee camps within Eritrea itself. And now when you first read about this, you think, oh, whoa, you're transporting these civilian populations out of where they originally were living. But as the Central Front was the primary location of the conflict, it was necessary to actually relocate civilians if there would be greater harm from staying in those heavy combat areas. And I also see that in the chat that there was the question, can you give civilians a choice? And in this situation, you can kind of see the levels of choice that a civilian may have. You can go to these caves or safe areas that you believe would be safe. Many people actually even stayed in the cities that they were living, even if they were under siege. And then there was other option of going to Eritrea itself, even if they were not Eritrean civilians. And so all of this shows how forced relocation and relocation of civilians can be a multivariate issue. And this also touches on the question of if you can even relocate individuals, not just populations. And so during this conflict, Ethiopia was charged with even taking political prisoners and sending them to prisons in Ethiopia. And this would be considered a very controversial and troubling decision by Ethiopian forces as they're moving them into the interior of Ethiopia. And so we can move to our next scenario.
So for this scenario, we're going to focus on judicial systems. So at the beginning of the rebel insurgencies in occupied Eastern Genovia, one town was designated as an area of high rebel activity. And in this town, a man was arrested for stealing from a Panem officer's house. But the arrest was truly because he was suspected of having heavy involvement with the rebel movement. The man has been detained for 3 years. He was denied trial because the Panem government argues that there is no established court system in occupied territory, and he is a threat to public safety. When the war comes to an end, the man is released. So did Panem fulfill their duties as an occupying power under international humanitarian law? Looks like we have a strong lean towards no in the poll. And if anyone has any thoughts or anything, you can also go ahead and use the chat. Trial was denied.
So it's looking like the general answer is no. And if we look to our next slide, we'll see that that is, in fact, the correct answer. So remember, as I was saying, that when you are an occupying power, you are truly trying to continue to provide those civil services that were established before occupation began. And this includes a judicial system. Now, does this judicial system have to be elaborate and have, every single high-level system to it? No, because you're still in a war conflict. But for this situation, the man should have been provided a trial. He should have been able to provide evidence of his innocence, and he shouldn't have been held there for 3 years without the ability to testify on behalf of himself or with somebody else to represent him. And so this all ties into the fact that occupying powers must provide some level of civilian services, even if it is a judicial system, even if the person is believed to be a political rival. You must provide them with those rights. And so we also have a case study that shows how this happens in the real world.
The case study we have is Aljetta v. the United Kingdom, and this is a question of jurisdiction. So British authorities believe that Aljetta was responsible for recruiting terrorists and planning attacks in Iraq. Aljetta was held for 3 years in a detention facility after he was arrested by the British authorities, and he was held in this detention facility without trial, and also he was not charged with any specific crimes during this time by the British forces. And the UK tried to claim that they were working with a multinational force, and so they actually had no jurisdiction, and instead the responsible party should be the United Nations. However, the court hearing this case declared that at the time that Aljetta was arrested and detained, the United Kingdom and the United States were considered occupying powers in Iraq because this occurred right after the fall of the Ba'ath regime. Therefore, the UK was required to uphold international humanitarian law, and the court determined that the UK had jurisdiction to charge Aljetta with a specific crime and to try him. And so then after that, the UK tried to bring a claim that there was conflict with another UN Security Council decision, and that imposed hardship on their ability to bring Aljetta to trial. However, it was determined that despite there being reviews of Aljetta's holdings, there was no attempts to try him before the court. So in this instance, this is a real-life example of a country violating their duty to provide judicial services to people detained in a combat zone. And so the UK should have charged Aljetta with a charge for a specific crime, and then also provided him with a trial. But as it was, he was detained for several years until this was reviewed by the court. And during that time, he was not given a chance to go to trial and was not charged with specific crimes.
And now for our final scenario. You are a citizen living in southeastern Genovia. And while there are still Pan Am forces in your territory, the local elections have been held, and you've been able to establish some level of normalcy with these newly elected officials. These officials have also been recognized by the Pan Am forces that are still within your region. These elected officials also have connections with the Genovian government that is established in the West. So the question is, what is the state of occupation in your area? It looks like it's actually leaning towards the occupation is ongoing. I see in the chat still occupied per ICRC, maybe not per IHL. Interesting answer. It looks like it's leaning towards occupation is ongoing. If the Pan Am military have the power to recognize local elections, then it is still occupied. Interesting point. It's a tricky one, yeah. Um, so it looks like the general consensus is that occupation is ongoing. Um, However,
So for this scenario, our answer is actually that occupation has ended. And this could definitely vary based on the definition of actual control, and there are definitely two sides to this argument. For the purpose of this scenario, what we were trying to paint with our scenario on the last page was that even though there are still Panem forces in the area, actual authority has been given back to the local government, the local Genovian government. They held their elections. The Panem forces haven't stepped in. They aren't asserting their control. They've just given the authority back to the Genovian government, and the Genovian government is going forward with that authority. So under that scenario, occupation has ended. And that is to say, and this is just to show too that all military forces don't have to leave an area for occupation to have ended. There can still be a presence of military forces there, but if effective control and authority has been given back to the territory itself, in this case, Genovia, then occupation has effectively ended.
and with that, that concludes our scenarios and our primer on occupation. We hope that these scenarios were able to show how the decision making in these situations is truly influenced by occupation law. And as you saw with many of the scenarios, the decisions were not cut and dry. It's not often black and white, and it's often a very personal decision up to the people who have authority, whether or not they will follow these rules, but it's to guide these actors towards the better decisions. And I want to thank you all for engaging and being very present with our scenarios. And if you want any more information, you can contact the email that's listed on the slide.
And I want to thank you, everyone. My name is Thomas Harper. I'm the Senior Legal Advisor for the American Red Cross IHL team. I want to extend a special congratulations to Amelia and Yanni. They briefly touched on this at the start of this, but this excellent, really engaging presentation was put together, was theorized, and executed by these two. Yanni's an undergraduate student at Columbia, and Amelia's a rising third-year law student at Arizona State Law School. I know I can speak for myself. I would not be able to pull off a presentation like this when I was in their shoes, either in law school or during my undergraduate time. So I have a tremendous amount of respect and gratitude for the hard work that they put into this. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out and supporting this. If you're interested in getting involved in our programming, whether at the youth or the adult level, we have a ton of opportunities. We'd welcome you to send us an email, IHLaw, as I gobble the words, at redcross.org. And thank you. Christian, if you see any unresolved questions, we're happy to field those. But otherwise, thanks for coming out, and we hope you learned something along the way. Thanks, Amelia. Thanks, Yanni.